Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sigma 12mm f1.4 DC Contemporary, an ultra-wide-angle prime lens with a bright aperture that's designed for mirrorless cameras with cropped APS-C sensors. Costing around £520, dollar price and description, it's available for Sony E, Fujifilm X and Canon RF mounts, although interestingly for Sigma not Leica L, at least not yet. Meanwhile, Nikon Z owners can keep their fingers crossed. 12mm joins Sigma's existing range of f1.4 primes for APS-C bodies, including 16, 23, 30 and 56mm models. Mount it on a Sony or Fujifilm body and their 1.5x field reduction will deliver an 18mm equivalent field of view, while Canon's slightly tighter 1.6x crop will turn it into a 19.2mm. In terms of some rivals in the APS-C format, Samyang has a 12mm f2 with autofocus for Sony E, 7 Artisans has a manual focus 12mm 2.8 for Canon RF, and Zeiss has a 12mm f2.8 for Fujifilm X. But none are as bright as the new Sigma though, and it's interesting to note that Sony, Fujifilm and Canon don't yet offer 12mm primes of their own for their APS-C systems. In fact, the only 12mm 1.4 lens I can remember is the Leica DG model, but that's only designed for the smaller Micro Four Thirds system, and even then it sells for around double the price of this Sigma. So Sigma's 12mm 1.4 is a pretty unique lens, particularly so for Canon's APS-C bodies, which are starved of both bright and prime options. So for this video I've decided to review the RF version on an EOS R7 body, but my results will also roughly apply to the other versions, albeit with their fractionally wider coverage. Measuring 68mm in diameter and 69mm long, the 12mm 1.4 is a fairly compact lens and light too at 225 grams. Sigma describes it as being dust and splash resistant, including a rubber grommet at the mount. Like all of Sigma's cameras and lenses, it's made in their Aizu factory in Japan. There's two main controls. Closest to the mount on the Canon RF version here is a free-spinning, unlabeled, clicky control ring, which can be assigned to a function like adjusting the exposure compensation, white balance or ISO. It's also possible to assign it to aperture. Meanwhile, on the Sony and Fujifilm versions, this is switched for a dedicated and labelled aperture ring with hard stops, an A position for body-based control, and the chance to declick if preferred. The second control is the free-spinning manual focusing ring, which turns nice and smoothly. And at the end of the barrel is a 62mm filter thread and a bayonet for mounting the supplied petal hood, which twists on and off without the need for a locking button. Okay, now for my tests, all made with a Canon EOS R7 body, and since the lens is designed to be used with profiles, that's how I'm going to be evaluating it here. Now these are applied automatically for JPEGs, but if you shoot in RAW, you will need to apply them or you're going to see barrel distortion and more obvious vignetting. Let's start with autofocus for photos, using a single AF area in the middle of the frame. Here you can see the focusing is almost instant, confidently locking onto the nearby bottle or the wall in the background. Next, for the same test but for video, with the aperture wide open again at f1.4. Here there can be a slight pause when using the R7's default settings, but the focus rack from near to far and back again is very smooth, and the Sigma focusing motors are also essentially silent in operation. Let's now give it a moving target using the full AF area with face detection enabled. Like all ultra-wide lenses, there'll of course be some distortion if you get too close, but step back even a little and you can see how it's ideal for capturing environmental portraits with lots of the surroundings. Meanwhile, the f1.4 aperture will deliver some separation and background blur when the subject is reasonably close. I'm going to show you some vlogging tests later in the review. But now a quick look at focus breathing with the lens aperture f16 and manually adjusting the focus from infinity to the closest distance and back again. As you focus closer, the field of view broadens a little, as if you were zooming to a slightly shorter focal length. But it's not a huge difference, and remember you are looking at the full focusing range here, not a more typical shorter focus pull. Okay, now for my optical test, starting as always with my distant real-life landscape view, far more interesting than photographing a chart at close range. I've angled it so that details run into the corners, and you're looking at the lens wide open at f1.4 here. Taking a closer look in the middle of the frame shows good, well-defined details right out of the gate. As I gradually close the aperture, I'd say there's not much difference until you reach around f4 to 5.6, where there's a small boost in sharpness and contrast if you're really pixel peeping. So back to the 1.4 sample before heading into the far corner. Here you're going to see some darkening in the corners due to vignetting, even with the profile applied, although that is fairly normal for wide-angle lenses with bright apertures. There's also a little loss in sharpness, but overall it's not too bad. As you gradually close the aperture, the vignetting quickly lifts, and by f2.8 onwards there's a small boost in overall crispness. I'd say no need to close it much further unless you need a broader depth of field or you're fighting bright lighting conditions. Now for a handheld vlogging test at arm's length and the lens aperture wide open at f1.4 to show you the kind of separation that's possible. And this first clip was filmed on the EOS R7 using IBIS sensor shift stabilization alone. This combination is mostly avoiding edge warping here and looks okay. Next for the R7 with IBIS and digital movie stabilization set to standard. As always, this means there's a minor crop applied to provide the spare pixels for improved stabilization, and I'd say it's keeping the footage a little bit more level here. And finally for the R7 with IBIS and movie stabilization set to enhanced. This time the crop is much more substantial, and while the footage is less wobbly as a result, I'd say it's now a bit too tight for handheld vlogging at arm's length. Maybe if you were holding it one-handed or on a pole it could work better, but returning to the original clips, I'd say this lens will definitely be a popular choice for the vloggers out there. For a more formal look at rendering and background blur, it's time for my bokeh ball test, photographed from near to the closest focusing distance. Starting here with the aperture wide open at f1.4. Under these conditions, it's possible to enjoy more background blur than you might expect for this kind of focal length, and taking a closer look at the blobs shows them to be reasonably well behaved with only minor outlines and textures within. As you close the aperture, the blobs become more uniformly shaped across the frame, while from f2.8 onwards you'll begin to notice the geometric shape influenced by the 9 diaphragm blades. Meanwhile, at the other end of the scale, here's how the lens looks for diffraction spikes at the minimum aperture of f16. Here they're very well defined when pointing directly at the sun. And now for a quick flare test, panning past the sun with the aperture close to f11 here. There's minimal flaring visible, although when it does appear on this lens and body combination, you'll see a little rainbow pattern. And now the sky at night, as a bright, ultra-wide prime lens will be tempting for anyone who's into wide-field astrophotography. So here's a 6-second exposure at 400 ISO on the EOS R7 with the lens aperture wide open to f1.4. I've tweaked the levels to make the stars stand out a bit more here. Taking a closer look in the middle shows well-behaved star shapes, while heading towards the corners shows the lens minimizing the coma artifacts that are often seen on other ultra-wide angle lenses at large apertures. Obviously the lens profile here is wrangling those points of light, but I'd still say that the out-of-camera result here looks pretty good. And finally, a macro test from the closest focusing distance and the aperture close to f4, where the lens has delivered 122mm across the frame. Just before wrapping up, even though the lens is designed for cropped APS-C sensors, you may be wondering how well it performs on a full-frame body. Is it in fact possible to make a milder crop than 1.5 or 1.6 times, for instance? So here's the lens on the left with a full-frame sensor, and on the right with Canon's 1.6 times APS-C crop applied. I captured both of these with an EOS R8 body, and since APS-C lenses do force it into a 1.6 times crop mode whether you like it or not, I had to actually slightly detach the lens in order to capture the whole frame. This in turn has disabled focusing and left the aperture wide open, so it's not going to be a practical option on Canon bodies, but it could be interesting for Sony owners. I'll now overlay a frame where the outer edge indicates the Canon 1.6 times crop, and this shows how much is usable outside. And now for the slightly milder 1.5 times crop of Sony and Fujifilm's APS-C formats. You will notice there's still some usable area beyond the 1.5 times crop though, which could prove interesting for those with full frame bodies wanting to use their best video stabilization modes. For example, now here's a 16:9 shaped video frame with the substantial 1.3 times crop of Sony's most powerful dynamic steady shot applied. And while it does dip very slightly into the imaging circle with a little darkening in the corners as a result, I'd say it's actually quite usable for many situations. When using the 12mm on a full-frame Sony with a 1.3 times crop applied for dynamic stabilization, you're going to end up with just under 16mm of effective coverage with a nice bright aperture. Unfortunately, the frame will almost certainly pass outside the imaging circle when dealing with more vigorous stabilization though, so your final image quality is going to vary, but it is an interesting option nonetheless. And don't forget, it could also prove suitable for any full frame cameras that apply say a 1.3 to 1.5 times crop when recording higher frame rate video or particularly high resolution or high speed options. Okay, now for my final verdict, during which I'm going to show you more photos taken with the lens on an EOS R7 body. Sigma continues to proudly fly the flag for APS-C systems with another excellent lens that will delight owners of cropped bodies, whether they're shooting Sony, Fujifilm or Canon. The 12mm 1.4 delivers ultra-wide coverage with a bright aperture and results that are sharp into the corners with the chance for some background blur if the subject's reasonably close. Like most modern lenses, it employs profiles to correct for inevitable barrel distortion and darkening in the corners, but when used as designed, the 12mm will give you plenty of drama with decent quality. I also like the physical construction, whether sealed and featuring a control ring for the Canon version or a dedicated aperture ring for the Sony and Fujifilm owners. And if you own a full-frame Sony body, the imaging circle is actually just about big enough to allow you to accommodate the milder 1.3 times crop of dynamic steady shot with only mild vignetting, giving you the option to film with what becomes a 16mm equivalent lens. So it becomes another recommended option from Sigma for crop body owners, and bonus points for making it available for Canon RF as well. Meanwhile, we can keep our fingers crossed for Nikon Z, and of course full-frame lenses in the RF and Z mounts in the future. And that's it for this lens review. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and if you found it useful, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider giving this video a like or my channel a follow. It really does help. Oh, and I've also got a separate review of the Sigma 17-40mm 1.8 zoom that was launched alongside it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.